You were at the retreat, I think, when we had a very knowledgeable and important person at the stand. And I asked a burning question that I've always had, which was, did they know that the vaccine wouldn't really be effective from the beginning? And that it might even be dangerous. And if you already knew that, why would you risk the sort of moral status or reputation of an entire industry by promising that you're going to use this shot to get out of the pandemic, that actually you knew was not going to actually produce any public health benefit? Why would you do this? And the answer came to us, a very credible answer, that it was a test of a technology. Do you remember that moment?
I sure do. You know, this is Brownstone has many threads and many purposes, but keeping the proper, most important questions of COVID alive so that we ultimately come to understand what happened to us and why seems to be central. And I will say I'm still wrestling even with that answer, because although it very much does feel that this was a test, not just of a technology, but of an entire program of control, a program that was previewed in Event 201 in 2019. So, you know, I've asked myself and asked publicly if there's something special, if they needed us inoculated for some reason, because if they didn't, first of all, they could run a test on a much smaller population. You didn't need to inoculate billions of people in order to test this. That could be done at a much smaller scale.
Excellent point.
And if they had given us shots that were basically empty, maybe technically contained something, but not enough to matter, then given the sleight of hand they played with all of the data and the statistics, they could have pretended that it worked. They could have declared that it had ended the pandemic. The injuries that you and me and many others feared would emerge wouldn't have, and we would have looked like we had been worried for nothing. So I think they would have won if they had used shots that just didn't have an effect and pretended that they had saved us. And the fact that they didn't do that is still a head scratcher to me.
You know, you make an excellent point, and I think all the research we have bears it out. We had achieved very high levels of seroprevalence by the late fall of 2020, before the shot release. And you've seen this. The studies of South Dakota were showing, 50 and 60% seroprevalence before the vaccine was ever released. So you're right. If they had just come out with a saline shot or just nothing, everybody we would have achieved endemicity regardless. Already probably had. Then you could have just said, look, see, we fixed it with the vaccine. They didn't do that.
They didn't do that, and it is the reason that so much of the public is awake. And they're not fully awake. They don't know what they're awake to, but a lot of people know that something terrible happened. A lot of people fear the shots that they themselves took. And that was either about something, either injecting people had a purpose that we don't know, or it was the greatest own goal in history, because they revealed how ready they were to lie to us, that their quality control didn't exist, that they didn't think twice about it, that they would inject people who stood to gain nothing from this, people who had natural immunity, as you point to, people for whom the risk couldn't conceivably be justified, like pregnant women, young, healthy children. And the fact is, the disease, as much as I think it's more dangerous than we now give it credit for, is certainly not deadly. The data shows that it killed very vulnerable people who were already either very old or very sick or both.
Ready to die from something, which was
Right.
my,
And it pulled them forward a few weeks. But if they had just let it run its course and, run in front of the parade and pretended that they were leading it, then the fact is COVID would have ebbed and, the evolution of the virus itself would have made it less dangerous, which maybe is what happened. People who were vulnerable would be eliminated from the population. So the vulnerability of the population drops. It looks like, the vaccine campaign worked. And in fact, there's this question across many vaccines, is the stuff that they're given credit for addressing was ebbing rapidly in the first place. And, is this just case after case of this industry running ahead of the parade and pretending to lead it?
The great promise of the mRNA platform was that it was going to finally win the race against mutations, which has been going on for 75 years. The 57, 58 flu pandemic, they developed an inoculation, but only after the thing became endemic. Losers. Same thing happened 68, 69 flu pandemic. There was an inoculation. By the time it came along, there wasn't a market for it. So this kept going. So the great industrial challenge then was, we've got to speed up the process. We've got to get the shot out before natural immunity makes it irrelevant, right? So, and you can imagine there's a thinking here that, well, in the past we were always late to by the time we got shot out, the virus had mutated or was already endemic. So it was a loser. Well, if we can get the shot out really fast, then we can save a lot of lives. Okay, that makes sense. And this was the time that they were going to deploy this great new technology, which is all about speed. But they didn't quite make it, right? They didn't make it out in time because there's logistical issues. There's all sorts of things. There were also political issues that delayed the release of the shot, right? They didn't want it coming out under Trump.
Right. Eric Topol, in fact, argued to delay it, revealing that he didn't care about human life either.
Yeah. Fauci sent Moderna back to the trials because they didn't have enough diversity, racial diversity in their trial subjects. But the whole goal was to get ahead of the mutations, really, to outrun nature, essentially. But they didn't. But that was the goal. But they tried, and it was the fastest vaccine that we have on record, right? From detection to inoculation, we reduced the time by a year or two or something like that. But it wasn't fast enough. Like I say, endemicity was probably here in November and December of 2020, which is a fact that is so mind blowing to me when you think about it.
Oh, it's stunning, and it's hard. It's hard not to be cynical about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is in its own way impressive that we have radically sped up the timeline for creating vaccine injuries, but I'm not sure that's a good thing. Frankly, I think a little slower would be better.
It's a really interesting point. But, Bret, to a larger point, and I hope you kind of get my theme here. As an economist, I'm very interested in the question of product viability. Like, what is an innovation that has its own energy? Where it's a customer base, it's efficiently produced, you've got manufacturers who can profit by making it, people benefit from it enough so they're willing to trade their own property in exchange to get it, like hamburgers or air conditioning or anything else you can think of, right? So the question is do vaccines qualify in the same way as any other consumer product? I think by looking at the history, going back 225 years, the answer is apparently in question. We don't actually know, because at every single stage of this, there's been some intervention that's sort of provided a subsidy, provided a mandate, provided some propaganda. Here's your agency, here's your indemnifications, here's your wartime mandates, here's your fancy philosophy called utilitarianism. It's been so much apparatus thrown at this one thing for 2.25 centuries you at some point have to ask the question, is this a really viable product in a normal society with a producer-consumer relationship? And I don't have the answer to that, but I would like to find out the answer. One possible answer is that there has been an ongoing revolt for more than 2 centuries that keeps being stamped down. Like, one of the things that's interesting, you think about 19th century media, not very big, not a lot of newspapers. There certainly wasn't an internet or even cable news shows. But when the newspapers of several cities would simultaneously get wind of a tremendous amount of vaccine deaths, they would run it on front page. And then the public would panic. And then the industry had a problem. All right, what are we going to do now? So that's when they go to government. Various things happen. Or in the case of 1822, Congress just said, just stop this nonsense. This has got to stop. But so every time there's public interest, the industry gets set back. They panic. They regroup. They find a new strategy, a new philosophical justification. They buy out some more doctors, some more journalists. Oh, here's how this. Here's how this. And this has been going on for all this time. So what I'm wondering is if maybe this time they went too far.
I think they did, and I think it's clear, and we have to consolidate our gains in revealing what they did. But a couple points along the way. One, I'm convinced by your article that once again what we have discovered is that pharma is vastly more sophisticated than we understand in its ability to pull one over on us, because it is the product of a long-running arms race that we only just started paying attention to. So the selective environment in the arms race has turned it into a ferociously capable bender of reality when we've only just woken up to the fact that reality is being bent. So we're playing catch up with a very sophisticated creature that is very well armed. But
a long institutional knowledge there on how to get around.
Long institutional knowledge. So I've given a couple presentations at Brownstone, and I've talked about it on Dark Horse about what I call the game of pharma, right? What I learned, dragged into thinking about pharma in a way that I never had before during COVID, is that we saw a game play out in which treatments for COVID that were good were portrayed as bad and dangerous. Treatments that weren't any good were portrayed as effective and safe. And effectively underneath pharma is, I would argue, an intellectual property racket. The game is you own a piece of intellectual property that has some plausible connection to health. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be plausible. And once you have that thing, now what you need to do is it's patented, and you need to create some research that makes it look promising. You need some research that makes it look like it outcompetes what we've already got. You need to make it look safe enough, and then at the higher levels of the game, you need to get it declared the standard of care so that doctors are afraid not to prescribe it and afraid to prescribe anything else. If you're really, on your game, you get it mandated, you get it paid for by the government, et cetera. So the point is, it's levels of the game, and we all caught up to this during COVID. But the point is, no, this is 24/7, 365 pharma on every one of these things. They're playing these games, and no kidding, they're better than us. We're like novice tennis players who just walked out onto the court with pros.